Call the member for Denison.
Thank you, Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That this House, 1, expresses its deep concern that there are now more than 50 million endangered people displaced or on the move globally, including more than 4 million Syrians on account of the current conflict. Secondly, calls on the government to act immediately to quickly resettle in Australia 30,000 affected Syrians, all in addition to the current humanitarian intake.
Member for Bass will cease interjecting.
All in addition to the current humanitarian intake of 13,750. And thirdly, further calls on the government to permanently double Australia's humanitarian intake from its current figure of 13,750 to 28,000.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for
I
Denison.
move that so much of standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the member for Denison from moving the following. That this House, 1, expresses its deep concern that there are now more than 50 million endangered people displaced or on the move globally, including more than 4 million Syrians on account of the current conflict. Secondly, calls on the government to act immediately to quickly resettle in Australia 30,000 affected Syrians, all in addition to the current humanitarian intake of 13,750. And thirdly, further calls on the government to permanently double Australia's humanitarian intake from its current figure of 13,750 to 28,000. Speaker, the parliament must suspend standing orders and deal with this matter urgently. The scale of this humanitarian crisis cannot be underestimated. There are now more than 50 million people displaced or on the move around the world. This is the largest number since the end of World War II. There are now—
The member for Denison will resume his seat. The member for Watson.
So, point of order. Just to assist the House, if I may, if the suspension wants to take place after question time, there'd certainly be no objection to that. We're very early in question time, and I just wanted to provide that option to the member for Denison.
The member for Denison has the call.
50 million people globally, the largest number since the end of the Second World War. There are now well over 4 million Syrians registered with UNHCR. This is a humanitarian crisis of profound proportions. Speaker, we must suspend standing orders and deal with this motion urgently, because Australia has the capacity to act. We are the 12th largest economy in the world. We do indeed have boundless plains to share. If there is one country in the world that has the capacity to do much more, it is this country. It is Australia. With the 12th largest economy in the world, it is shameful that last year we resettled or recognised and resettled only 14,350 refugees. Speaker, last year that 14,350 refugees which we recognised and resettled was less than half of 1% of all of the refugees recognised and resettled globally. Speaker, we like to make much of the fact that we're a generous country. It is said often that we are the most generous country when it comes to recognising and resettling refugees. That, in fact, is untrue. In fact, when you look at the number of people that we recognised and resettled last year, less than half of 1%, that made us 22nd in order of countries by raw numbers recognising and resettling refugees. When you look at this country's effort with refugees on a per capita basis, we are 27th in the world, not 1 or 2. When you look at this country in regard to GDP, we are the 46th country in the world when it comes to the number of refugees we recognise and resettle. How on earth can we compare 14,350 refugees being recognised and resettled when last year Turkey recognised and resettled 1,027,137? How can we possibly compare ourselves to Lebanon, which last year recognised and resettled 364,129 refugees? How on earth can we compare ourselves to Afghanistan, which last year recognised and resettled 283,575 refugees. By comparison, we recognised and resettled 14,350 refugees. Surely, Speaker, if there is one country in the world that can do more, much more, and I don't mean an extra 5,000 over the next 3 years, I mean 30,000 this year, then that is our country. And our country will be all the richer for it, because among that 30,000 will be Syrian doctors and tradesmen and engineers and architects and nurses and social workers, and any number of people that will undoubtedly add to this country's very rich multiculturalism. Speaker, standing orders must be suspended, and we must deal with this matter urgently, because we have contributed to the problem in the Middle East. Speaker, you cannot disentangle Iraq from Syria or Syria from Iraq. And when we helped invade Iraq 12.5 years ago, we helped create the instability which racks the region to this day. Speaker, when we gave diplomatic support to the Syrian rebels, we effectively gave diplomatic support to Islamic State, which was one of the rebels. And we now find ourselves in this ludicrous situation where we supported the rebels, but we're now going to bomb them. We're now going to bomb the enemy of President Assad, as the member for Melbourne gestured a little while ago. But what are we doing about President Assad? We're now going to bomb his enemies and basically become a de facto ally of Russia. How dare we criticise the Russians for having a military presence in Syria assisting President Assad when we're going to be bombing President Assad's enemies? Speaker, if I could make one final point. After the 2010 election, when I was in negotiations with then Prime Minister Julia Gillard and then Opposition Leader Tony Abbott, the then Opposition Leader—
Order. The member for Denison must confine himself to why standing orders should be suspended.
Thank you, Speaker. Standing orders must be suspended because we must deal with this matter urgently. And in fact, if we do deal with this matter urgently, perhaps the Prime Minister will find it in his heart to today make the commitment again that he made to me after the 2010 election, that Australia would double its humanitarian intake. Because not only do we need to take a one-off large number of Syrians to do our share of the heavy lifting at this point in time, we have to do a much greater share over years to come. Because there's 50 million people displaced and on the move at the moment, Speaker, around the world. We need to put in place a longer-term solution. We need to be part of a longer-term global solution. And surely, Speaker, that means doubling our humanitarian intake. If the Prime Minister, if the then Opposition Leader, could bring himself to suggest we double the humanitarian intake after the 2010 election, then surely then our Prime Minister can see it in his heart, can see it in his government's heart to do just that right now. Speaker, there is an urgent need to suspend standing orders and to deal with this matter right now. There is no pressing issue possibly to face this parliament right now than the crisis in Syria. You know, we can hold our press conferences, we can put out our press releases, we can come in here and we can talk till the cows come home. But until this parliament and until this government deals decisively with this issue, then everything we've done so far is just talk. So the challenge is now for the Prime Minister, the challenge is now for the government to do something today, to say, yes, we will bring in 30,000 Syrians, and not one of them will come from the existing humanitarian intake. To do something strong, to say that we will be part of a long-term global solution. We will be a good citizen. We will work with the community of nations. We will not leave it to Western Europe to shoulder this alone, and that we will double our humanitarian intake. I can, Speaker, but hope that although the government saw fit not to give me leave to address this matter now, that the government can now see it in its heart to have the debate now and to deal with this matter now as it must be done. Thank you, Speaker.